Under the wide, ever-changing sky of the countryside, a girl named Elia walked barefoot along a winding dirt path each morning. The breeze was cool at sunrise, soft and slow, brushing against her tangled hair like a mother might do. In her hands she carried wildflowers, delicate things with bright petals and thin stems. She knew which ones bloomed where and when. She picked them carefully, whispering their names like little prayers. The lavender for calm. The yellow yarrow for protection. A sprig of mint, always the freshest, for memory. These flowers were never for her. They were for the grave beneath the willow tree. Her mother had died when she was 10. Not all at once but slowly. Elia remembered the hush that had settled in their small cottage as her mother's breathing grew weaker. She remembered trying to press warmth into her mother's hands with her own, already small and thin from the food she'd begun skipping. Her mother had been everything: light, laughter, hands that could stitch and stir and soothe all in one motion. After she passed, the light in the cottage didn't just dim, it vanished. Elia was sent to live with her stepfather's second wife and her children, none of whom cared for her. They gave her a bed of straw by the kitchen hearth and reminded her often, "You eat what you earn." But the grave became her sanctuary. Every day without fail Elia went to the willow. It stood at the edge of the old cemetery where few people wandered. She spoke to her mother in whispers, never minding if the breeze carried her voice away. "They made me scrub the floors again, Mama," she'd say. "But I saved the bread crust. I'll eat it later with some honey if I can sneak it." Or, "I found a robin's egg today. Blue as the sky, just like you liked." She wasn't lonely, not here. The earth felt different beneath the willow, like it listened. The grave wasn't just dirt and stone. It held her mother's laughter, her lullabies, and the warmth of all the stories they never finished together. So Elia poured her heart into the ground every day, like watering seeds that might bloom into answers. Sometimes she even dreamed that the grave hummed back, a deep sound like the roots shifting to make room for her grief. In the village people talked. "Strange girl," they whispered. "Talks to the dead like they're still listening." They'd shake their heads as she passed, their own children turning away or giggling. "Grave girl," they'd mutter under their breath. At home her stepfamily was worse. Her stepmother, Risa, treated her like ash left in the fireplace, something to be swept away quickly and without ceremony. Risa's daughters, Alan and Brea, were a year or two older than Elia and sharp with their words. "You smell like the grave," Brea sneered one morning as Elia returned with soil on her dress. "Bet the dead talk to you because no one else wants to." Risa pretended not to hear. Or worse, laughed with them. Elia learned not to cry. Tears were useless currency in a house where nothing was given freely. She scrubbed floors, gathered firewood, fetched water from the stream with hands so cold they cracked. But even then she'd sneak away before dawn or after sunset, flowers tucked into the folds of her apron. Sometimes she'd pass a shop window and see her reflection. Mud on her hem, cheeks hollow, eyes too old for her age, and flinch. But then she'd gather more wildflowers and return to the willow, where none of that mattered. There she was only a daughter speaking to her mother. Spring came with quiet thunder. The kind of wind that shakes petals loose from trees and carries secrets through the grass. One evening, as Elia knelt beside the grave and pressed her fingers into the earth, something shifted. It was so small she nearly missed it, a subtle warmth that reached her fingertips. She paused, eyes narrowing. A breeze brushed against her cheek and for a moment, just a moment, she thought she heard her name. Not loud. Not whispered. Just known. The way only a mother could say it. She stayed longer that night. The sun dipped low and painted the clouds in colors she couldn't name. She sang softly, an old lullaby her mother used to hum while stirring soup. Her voice was shy but true. And when she finished, she thought she felt the earth sigh beneath her knees. Still nothing happened. No visions. No ghostly hands reaching out. Just the silence of dusk, familiar and thick. She gathered herself, left the flowers, and walked home slowly. Her heart felt heavier but not in a painful way. It was full somehow. Like the grave had spoken in silence. The next day she returned early, heart pounding. She cleared away old petals, set down fresh ones, and pressed her ear to the soil, not caring if she looked mad. But the earth was still and quiet as always. She told herself it was her imagination. It had to be. Graves didn't speak. And yet, the village buzzed with its own rhythm. Spring markets opened. Town criers announced news about taxes and traveling merchants. Risa sent Alan and Brea to the dressmaker, bought them lace gloves and satin ribbons. "You'll meet someone worthy this year," she said. Elia was not invited. Instead she was. The moon hung low that night, swollen and pale like a forgotten pearl tucked against the sky. Its light spread across the old graveyard in silver sheets, touching the edges of the willow tree and painting long shadows across the grass. Ilya sat on her knees beside the grave, her palms flat against the cool soil, her body trembling from the cold, or maybe from something deeper. She had cried before, countless times, but tonight her sobs came from a place she couldn't name, as though the grief had grown too large to keep buried in her chest. "I'm so tired, Mama," she whispered, her voice broken with weariness. "I don't know how much longer I can live like this." The wind, slow and steady, pulled strands of her hair across her cheeks. It should have been comforting, familiar even, but something about the air had shifted. It was too still, too thick, as if the world were holding its breath. Ilya's fingers sank into the damp soil. She closed her eyes and tried to steady her breathing, to quiet the ache in her heart that had howled all day. She hadn't eaten since morning, just a dry crust she managed to hide under her apron. Her stepmother had found her humming earlier and slapped her across the face, hissing, "You think you're too good to be silent like the rest of us? You want attention like your mother did, singing to make people feel sorry for her?" But Ilya hadn't been trying to be heard. She had only wanted to remember what it felt like to feel safe inside her own voice. So now she sat in silence, biting her lip until it bled, as tears slipped one after another down her cheeks. Then, something shifted. It was faint. At first, she thought it might be the rustling of a mole beneath the dirt or a bird fluttering in the willow branches. But then she felt it, not heard it, felt it. A soft stirring beneath her palms, like breath rising gently under the soil. And then, clearer than before, a whisper, "Ilya." She jerked back so quickly she fell onto her side, hands scrambling against the grass. Her breath caught in her throat, her eyes wide as they swept the darkness. "Who's there?" she called out, voice hoarse. Silence. Only the sound of wind rattling through the willow leaves like 1,000 paper wings. She stared at the grave, heart pounding in her chest like a drum. Her body was frozen between terror and disbelief. That voice, it wasn't imagined. It had come from beneath the soil. From her mother's grave. She stared at the headstone, barely legible now, worn smooth by years of rain and wind. Her hands trembled. "Did you say my name?" she whispered, feeling like a child again, waiting for a voice to respond in the night. There was no answer. Still, her name hung in the air like mist, like something alive that had just slipped out of reach. "No," she muttered to herself, shaking her head. No, I'm just tired. I'm hearing things." Her fingers dug into the earth again, as if trying to prove that it was still only dirt and root beneath her. Her skin met cool soil, but now it didn't feel lifeless. It pulsed, faintly, slow and deep, like something ancient beneath the surface had stirred. She pulled away and stood slowly, brushing the dampness from her skirt. She turned to leave but only made it a few steps before stopping. Her gaze shifted back to the grave. The wildflowers she had left earlier were upright again, though she'd been sure they were wilting when she arrived. The mint was greener. The petals fuller. And the earth looked like it had been touched, softened somehow, like someone had run their hands over it. Her feet wouldn't move. Something rooted her to the spot. She stared again, and this time the fear began to shift, just slightly, into curiosity. She knelt back down and laid her hand gently on the grave. It was warm now, not with the heat of the sun, but something deeper. Her eyes searched the moonlit sky. "If this is you, if this is real, please," she whispered, "just give me a sign." The wind stopped. Completely. Even the willow stilled, its branches no longer rustling. A moment of perfect, unsettling quiet stretched around her like a held breath. And then the sound again, not with her ears but inside her chest. A whisper like wind moving through hollow reeds, "You are not alone." Ilya gasped. Her eyes darted to the grave, her fingers twitching against the soil. She didn't move. She didn't run. Her body wanted to, but her heart felt something else. A strange warmth was blooming in her chest, like embers reigniting after a long cold. "You are not alone." The words echoed in her bones. "Mama?" she asked, voice barely audible. But no further voice came. Instead, a soft breeze stirred again, brushing against her skin not as wind, but like a caress. Gentle. Familiar. She closed her eyes and a tear rolled down her cheek, not from fear but from something deeper. A connection. A thread between worlds. She stayed like that for what felt like hours, afraid to move, not wanting the feeling to end. And when she finally stood, it was not with her usual weariness, but with something steadier in her limbs. Back at the cottage the fire had died down. No one noticed her return. Risa and the others were asleep. Ilya slipped into her straw bedding and lay awake, replaying the moment again and again. Had it truly happened? Had the grave whispered to her? Had the earth warmed beneath her palms? She touched her chest and found that same warmth still lingering. The next morning she rose before dawn. She didn't gather water. She didn't clean the hearth. She went straight to the willow carrying nothing, no flowers, no offerings. Only herself. The grave was quiet as before. The petals still looked fresher. The soil felt soft, undisturbed. Ilya closed her eyes, knelt, and laid both hands against the earth. Nothing. And then, again, the faintest breath. A shift. Her name felt rather than heard. A presence. One that knew her, one that had always known her. Not a ghost. Not a monster. Just her mother. Or something of her. Something that remained. Ilya smiled through her tears. The grave did not need to speak more. It had already told her what she most needed to hear. The next morning Ilya's fingers still trembled as she clutched the woven basket to her side, not with fear exactly, but with the heavy feeling of questions she couldn't carry alone. The world looked unchanged. The same morning mist hung in the hollows between the hills. The same roosters crowed. The same women scrubbed clothes against stones by the well. And yet, for Ilya, everything felt different. Something had shifted, not just beneath the soil but inside her. She needed answers. She needed to know if what she heard, what she felt, was madness or miracle. Her feet took her first to the well, where the eldest women of the village gathered like starlings at sunrise. They didn't like her, not exactly, they tolerated her because she was small, quiet, and kept her eyes lowered, but they whispered about her often enough. The sky was unusually heavy that morning, hanging low with bruised clouds as if the air itself held its breath. Ilya trudged up the familiar path, the worn soles of her shoes scuffing the earth with each step. The wildflowers she usually brought had already begun to wilt in her hands, petals curling at the edges, as though they too felt the strange weight pressing down on the world. It had been days since the whispering at the grave. Days since she had touched the earth and felt breath instead of soil. She hadn't spoken of it since, not to her stepsisters nor her stepmother, nor even the bird she sometimes fed at the edge of the garden wall. It sat inside her like a secret flame. But each night when she tried to sleep, her mother's voice, so faint, yet undeniably hers, returned not in dreams, but in the edges of her waking mind. You are not alone. She had begun to believe it. So when she arrived at the grave that morning and saw the crack, a thin line jagged across the headstone's face like a wound, she knew it wasn't the weather. No storm had struck it. No animal had clawed at it. It had broken from within. As though something beneath had stirred. She dropped the flowers. They landed softly in the grass and she barely noticed. Her eyes were fixed on the fissure. The stone, which had been whole and worn for years, now split like a hushed truth finally escaping a tight mouth. And at the base of the headstone, where only dry weeds had ever grown, a single flower now bloomed. It was unlike anything she had ever seen. Its petals shimmered faintly, not with dew or light, but with something inner, something like memory. It was pale, tinged with rose and gold, its center pulsing faintly as if alive. The surrounding earth was untouched. No other plant, no disturbed soil. Just that bloom. That impossible, beautiful bloom. Ilya knelt before it, afraid to blink. Her fingers reached out, trembling, hovering just above the petals. When she finally touched it, softly, reverently, she felt warmth. And then the voice returned. Ilya, my star. Beneath me. Look beneath. She gasped, the sound ripped from her lungs like a gust through an open window. Her hand flew to her mouth. The voice had been louder this time. Clear. Her mother. Not just a whisper now, but a thread of speech wrapped in breath and memory. She looked around. The graveyard was empty. Silent except for the rustle of wind through dry grass. Her gaze returned to the stone. She pressed her palm to the crack. Nothing. She touched the flower again. Beneath. Her heart began to race. You want me to dig? She whispered aloud, unsure who she was asking permission from, her mother, the heavens, or herself. Digging in a grave felt like sacrilege, like undoing something sacred. But the voice, so gentle, so full of love, had not come to harm. It had come to reveal. Ilya looked around, then moved to the side of the grave where the earth was looser. With her bare hands she began to dig. Her fingers clawed through roots and worms, dirt caking beneath her nails. Her breath came fast, not from effort, but from anticipation. Fear, wonder, disbelief all dancing in her chest like storm winds. She dug deeper. And then her fingers struck something hard. What? A small box, its corners rotted but the center still whole. She unearthed it carefully, brushing away the soil as if unwrapping something sacred. It was no bigger than a loaf of bread, held shut by an old, rusted clasp. She stared at it, heart-thudding. The flower pulsed behind her. She unlatched the clasp. Inside, cushioned in faded linen, lay a locket and a folded letter. The locket was gold, etched with a sun and a crescent moon entwined in a dance. Her breath caught. She had seen it once before, long ago, swinging from her mother's neck as she sang at the window. It had been her most precious possession. Ilya had asked once to hold it, and her mother had said, "When the time is right, my star, it will be yours." Now here it was. Her hands shook as she lifted the locket. It was warm, impossibly so, like it remembered the skin it once lay against. She pressed it to her chest and closed her eyes. Tears slipped down her cheeks. Then she opened the letter. The parchment was delicate, edges curled and browned. But the ink had not faded. Her mother's handwriting flowed across the page, strong and elegant. "My dearest Ilya, if you are reading this, then I have returned to you in some small way as I always promised I would. I feared this world would not be kind to you without me. If I could have stayed, I would have. But I felt the shadows closing in and I knew the time was near. This box contains my love, my truth, and a part of me that refused to die. The locket holds more than memory. Inside is a secret I never had time to tell. One day when you are strong enough, open it. It will guide you to what was hidden from both of us. Do not be afraid of the voices. Not all that is buried is meant to be forgotten. You are my star, my light in the dark. Let no one convince you you are less than the sun. All my love always, your mother." Ilya folded the letter with reverence, her tears wetting the parchment. The grave lay quiet again, the whisper gone, the wind returned. She looked up at the sky. The clouds had parted slightly. A beam of sunlight broke through and landed directly on the flower. And for the first time in her life, Ilya did not feel alone. She clutched the box to her chest, the locket around her neck, and whispered back to the grave, "I found it, Mama. I found you." The flower trembled once in the breeze, then stilled. The stone was cracked. The silence was broken. And everything had changed. The sky had turned the color of slate by the time Ilya reached home. She clutched the wooden box to her chest like it might dissolve if she let go, the locket still warm against her skin. Her fingers were stained with dirt, her dress torn at the hem, but she barely noticed. Her steps were heavy, not with fatigue but with the weight of something vast and irreversible. She had unearthed a piece of her past, and it pulsed in her hands like a second heart. She waited until the house was asleep. The creaking of her stepmother's floorboards had stilled. The twins, her stepsisters, had fallen silent after their usual mocking lullabies. Only the distant hoot of an owl kept her company now, and the soft rustle of wind through cracked windows. By candlelight she reopened the letter. It was longer than she'd realized. The first part, the one she'd read at the grave, had been written in urgency and love. But as she carefully unfolded the remaining portion, a second message revealed itself, one meant for her alone when she was old enough to bear it. Her mother's handwriting shifted. Firmer. More precise. "Ilya, if you are reading this far, then you are braver than I ever dared to hope. The truth I must now give you is a heavy thing, but you have already carried so much alone. You deserve to know the full story of where you came from, and why danger once circled us like wolves." Ilya's breath caught. She read faster. "You were born not just from love but from defiance. Your father was not the man they told you he was. He was no simple traveler, no forgotten merchant swept away by illness. He was a nobleman, of high blood, who fell in love with a village girl against his family's wishes. He left his name behind to be with me. We had little, but our joy was enough." Ilya's hands trembled. Her father, a nobleman? But joy often invites envy. And your stepfamily, they were not always strangers to me. Your stepmother was once a cousin to your father's house. She hated me for winning his heart. She schemed for years, until at last, when you were just a baby, he disappeared under mysterious circumstances during a journey to the borderlands. They said it was a raid. But I never believed it. A chill moved through Ilya's bones. I began to fear for you. For us. When the illness came, it felt too timely. Too sudden. I drank from a cup brought by your stepmother the night before I fell sick. I wrote this letter as the fever grew. I hid the box in the earth, under the place where my body would rest, where I hoped you would still come, still remember, still find me." Ilya gasped, the letter falling into her lap. Poison. Her mother had been poisoned. Her stepmother had brought the cup. Her father, vanished under a veil of mystery. All her life, the whispers, the cold glances from the villagers, the sideways smirks, It had been a story woven with lies. A stolen inheritance perhaps. A hidden name. And her, left in a house where the murderers of her joy lived like queens, feeding off the silence of the past. She clutched the letter again, reading the final lines. I could not stop them, Ilya. But I planted the truth like a seed, knowing that one day, you would water it with your tears and it would bloom. They may lie. They may silence. But the truth will rise like the sun. And so will you. Her shoulders began to shake. The tears came fast, thick and hot, sliding down her cheeks like rain over stone. She wept into her palms, into the candlelight, into the shadows that seemed to lean in and listen. She cried for her mother, for her father, for every lie told and every kindness withheld. She cried for the girl who had knelt by a grave whispering into dirt, thinking no one heard her. Now she knew someone had. The truth will rise like the sun. The voice, her mother's, returned then. Not from the letter but from somewhere deep beneath her, deeper than the floorboards, deeper than stone. A voice threaded through memory and magic. You are the dawn, my star. It was not a whisper. It was a promise. Ilya stood, candle in one hand, letter in the other. She moved to the cracked mirror in the hallway and looked at herself, not the servant, not the silent girl. She saw the eyes of a woman born of love and rebellion, daughter of a nobleman, child of a mother who had fought to speak across death itself. She unclasped the locket. It opened with a soft click. Inside were two things: a pressed wildflower, now fragile as breath, and a folded scrap of parchment. She opened it carefully. A map. Crude, hand-drawn, showing a forest edge and a symbol, an old sun crest she vaguely remembered from childhood stories. The noble family's mark. So the truth was not just buried in words. There were places too. Secrets in trees and paths, waiting. Her heart beat faster. A plan was forming, not of revenge but of reclamation. Her name, her past, her voice. In the dark room behind her, a floorboard creaked. She turned slowly. Nothing. But she could feel it, that the house had shifted. The old stillness was gone. Something had awakened. Not just in her. In everything. She folded the map and placed it back into the locket, now knowing what it truly held, not a memory but a key. The sun was not yet up, but the stars were fading. She stood by the window, watching the horizon. The voice came again, one final time before the day broke. Rise, my daughter. The world remembers. The storm rolled in just before dusk, thick clouds pressing low over the village as if the sky itself were bearing down on the world below. Ilya hurried home with the locket hidden beneath her tunic, the map folded tightly inside. Her steps were careful, measured, her mind turning like a wheel. She had not slept the night before, too shaken by the revelations of the letter, but she did not feel tired. If anything, her body hummed with energy, something deeper than fear or hope. It felt like her mother's voice was still inside her, guiding every step. She entered the manor quietly. The house stood colder than usual, as though the walls themselves sensed what she had learned. Her stepmother's voice echoed faintly from the drawing room, sharp, insistent, arguing with someone. Probably with her stepbrother Marin again. They had been growing restless lately, talking in half-muttered phrases and pulling away when she entered a room. Ilya moved quickly to the attic, her secret place, where the few belongings of her mother were kept in an old trunk under a moth-eaten quilt. She tucked the locket in beside them. The box she'd dug from the grave, the letter, the dried flower, they all rested there now, part of a story no longer buried. But she hadn't realized Marin had followed her. She didn't hear him until she turned around, and there he was, looming in the narrow doorway like a shadow pulled up from the floor. "What are you hiding, grave mouse?" he sneered. Ilya froze. She said nothing, heart thudding. He stepped forward, eyes glinting. "You think we don't see it? You've been different. Slipping away. Whispering to dirt like it talks back." He laughed, but it had no humor. She backed up slowly. "Don't come near me. You're not clever," he snapped. "You're just like your mother, always pretending you're better than us." She thought she could outlive what we did. Thought we wouldn't notice her poison schemes. Ilya's breath caught. "You knew," she whispered. "You knew she was poisoned." Marin's mouth twisted. She brought it on herself. Always snooping. Always threatening to go to the law. What do you think people do to rats that stir the nest? He lunged toward the trunk. She tried to block him, but he shoved her aside. The candlelight flickered as he pried the lid open and grabbed the locket, turning it over in his hand. "This," he barked. "This is what's made you act like a queen? Marin, don't." He grinned, holding it over the candle flame. "Let's see if it burns." But the moment the metal hovered over the flame, something strange happened. The air shifted. The room seemed to breathe. And then, a loud crack. The trunk burst open from within, as if struck by an invisible force, scattering letters, fabric and petals into the air. The candle tipped. The fire caught instantly. Within seconds the quilt ignited. Flames licked across the floorboards like they had been waiting. "What did you do?" Marin shouted, stumbling back. "It wasn't me," Ilya cried. The fire danced unnaturally fast, skipping from corner to corner, climbing the beams. The attic groaned as the heat swelled. Marin dropped the locket and fled down the stairs, screaming for help. Ilya snatched the locket from the floor, it was unscorched, still cool, and grabbed the box of belongings, wrapping it in her apron. She barely made it down the narrow stairs before the attic roof exploded in embers above her. The house erupted in chaos. Her stepmother's shrieks filled the air. Maids ran in all directions and the stable boy tried throwing water on the lower floor. But the fire had already taken the walls, the paintings, the tapestries. Smoke poured from every seam. Ilya burst out the front door just as the roof caved in with a deafening crash. The villagers came running, buckets in hand, blankets soaked in the well. But it was too late. The manor stood like a skeleton in flame, roaring into the sky. And Ilya, soot-streaked, her hair wild, her eyes wide, stood before it with her mother's things clutched tight. "She escaped the attic," someone whispered. "With the fire starting right there? Look at her, she's untouched." Rumors flew faster than the wind. Marin stood across the field, watching her with fury and something else, something closer to fear. He hadn't seen what she saw. He didn't feel the house shift, didn't hear the attic breathe, didn't witness the flames rise around the locket and part like a wave. Someone offered Ilya a blanket. She shook her head. Another offered to take her in for the night. She declined that too. She walked alone to the edge of the village and sat near the graveyard fence, where the earth was quiet, still warm from the day's sun. She laid her mother's belongings before her and held the locket to her chest. The fire hadn't been normal, and the villagers knew it. By morning the story had twisted, that the house burned from guilt. That ghosts didn't forget. That the girl who wept at graves had been protected by something older than fire. Her stepfamily tried to blame her. But the villagers had started asking questions. Questions like why she had been locked away in the attic. Why Marin had burns on his hands but not a scratch on the girl. Why the locket had no scorch, no soot, no mark of heat. Whispers spread. And behind the whispers the soil whispered too. "You were never alone," it seemed to say. Ilya sat in the early light, watching the smoke still curling from the manor's remains and said aloud, not to the villagers but to the sky, "You tried to burn what belonged to her. But she was fire first." She stood slowly and walked back to her mother's grave, every step new. Behind her, the village watched, not with mockery but with wonder. The dream came with the scent of time and damp stone. Ilya stood barefoot on soil still warm from sun, though above her the sky shimmered silver like moonlight. Her mother knelt ahead, hands buried in green leaves, humming a lullaby that tugged something loose in Ilya's chest. Her fingers moved gently over rows of herbs, brushing aside dirt to reveal small, glistening vials beneath the earth. Then she looked up, not startled, not sad, only expectant. Ilya woke before dawn, her heart racing. The air was still, cool, yet something inside her burned with clarity. She didn't hesitate. She wrapped her mother's letter in cloth, tucked the locket beneath her blouse, and slipped from the remnants of the house that barely still stood after the fire. The villagers had started to mutter, some afraid, some suspicious, but none had helped. But Ilya no longer moved with the weight of their words. The dream had been too clear. The garden she now believed was real. She followed the edge of the woods behind the old cemetery, taking narrow paths long overgrown with vines and thorns. Her mother had spoken of this place once long ago, calling it the quiet corner. Back then Ilya had thought it just another bedtime story. It took hours of searching. The sun was high overhead when she found it, a rusted iron gate swallowed in bramble and shadow. Nature had tried to erase it but the outline remained. Vines tangled over it like a curtain of green, resisting her hands. Thorns tore at her sleeves, but Ilya pulled and yanked until a path opened wide enough for her to squeeze through. What lay beyond made her breath catch. A sunken garden encircled by mossy stones. Beds of long-dead herbs lay beneath layers of dry leaves. Ivy clung to a collapsed arbor where roses once bloomed. And at the center, beneath a broken statue of a woman holding a bowl, was a rotting wooden bench, still intact enough to hold her weight. It was quiet here, as if the world outside had fallen away. She knelt near the base of the statue and began to dig, her hands trembling. She didn't know what she was searching for, only that the dream had shown her roots and vials, and she trusted that memory. The earth gave way easily. Beneath just a few inches of soil, her fingers struck wood. She uncovered a small chest, wrapped in oiled cloth, preserved against time. Inside it were glass jars, the herbs inside dried and curled but still fragrant. Lavender, mugwort, feverfew. Alongside them lay a bundle of thin journals, tied with string. Ilya opened the top one with care. The handwriting was unmistakable. Her mother's script, looped and steady, pressed into every line. The villagers say to heal is to interfere with fate. But what if fate is a wound waiting for a salve? What if silence is the worst illness of all? Page after page held notes on healing, on poultices, on the right way to speak to a mother in mourning. There were lists of names, people her mother had helped. Small sketches of roots, of wounds, of stars. One page was stained with tears and the entry beneath read, "They said I used magic. I used marigold and mercy. They said I poisoned. I fed their sick children with broth when no one else would." Ilya's throat tightened. She read faster, greedier. Her mother had not simply tended a garden, she had tended people. Quietly, carefully. And they had turned on her for it. She understood now. The whispers around the village, the strange looks from the elders when she'd asked about the graveyard. The coldness of her stepfamily. They hadn't just despised her mother for being different. They had feared her. And when her help became inconvenient, or perhaps when it brought too much truth, they had condemned her. Just like they whispered now about Ilya. Her hands, dirt-covered and sore, closed around a final item at the bottom of the chest, a necklace strung with seeds carved like runes, old and fragrant. She placed it around her neck beside the locket and felt, absurdly, as if her spine straightened on its own. The weight of it was not heavy but grounding. She spent the day there, clearing leaves, reading more of the journals. She found recipes for teas that soothed nightmares, oils that healed burns, instructions on listening not only to pain but to the way people carried it. Her mother had been more than kind, she had been wise. Ilya sat on the moss-covered bench and stared at the ruins of the arbor. It had once supported vines and blooms, and though now bare, she could still imagine the color it must have held. She imagined her mother sitting here, quietly mixing herbs, brushing dirt from a page, hearing the first whispers of what would one day destroy her. She heard her mother's voice again in her mind, not the dream this time, not a spirit, but the memory of lullabies, of a woman who had sung over every skinned knee and feverish night. Who had once said, "Some gardens don't grow until you bleed into the soil first." Ilya wept. Not from grief, but from knowing. She gathered the journals and placed them in a woven sack. She took a few of the seeds from the necklace and pressed them into the ground near the statue, watering them with the flask she carried. She didn't know if they would grow. But she would try. As the light faded, she stood. She was no longer just the orphan girl who wept at a grave. No longer the servant in her own home, nor the shadow behind her stepbrother's cruelty. She was her mother's daughter. A healer's daughter. And though the village had tried to bury that truth, the roots had reached up anyway. That night, as she slept beside the garden under the open sky, the wind moved through the vines like a song she almost remembered. And when morning came, a single sprout had pushed through the soil where she had planted. Green. Alive. The beginning. The sky was gray the morning Ilya returned to the village square, but it did not rain. The clouds merely hung there, pregnant with storm, yet holding their fury, as if the heavens too were watching. Ilya walked slowly, the sack of journals pressed close to her chest, the locket around her neck warm with remembered grief. She had not spoken to another soul since discovering the garden, since sleeping under the stars and waking to the first signs of life in soil once thought dead. Now she returned not with vengeance, but with truth. And that was heavier. Word had already spread. The fire. The cracked headstone. The rumors of light breaking from the grave. The old whispers about her mother, once buried in silence, now unearthed like brittle bones. Her stepfamily had not expected her return, not like this. They'd whispered that she had run off mad into the woods. That she'd lost her mind with grief. But it was not madness that brought her back. It was clarity. The village square was not large, but it felt like a coliseum as people began to gather. Shopkeepers stepped away from their stalls. Children peered from behind shawls. The elders sat beneath the old tree in the center, gnarled hands folded, suspicion in their eyes. And there stood her stepfamily. Her stepmother, Cyril, face pinched tight with worry disguised as scorn. Her stepbrother Jorin, arms folded over his chest, a half-smirk playing on his lips. He hadn't looked worried after the fire, he had looked satisfied. But he didn't smile now. Ilya stood opposite them, her feet planted in the dust. "I ask for a hearing," she said, her voice steady, carried on the quiet. There was a long silence. Then Elder Tharn, the eldest of the council, lifted his chin. "And what do you bring, girl?" "The grave speaks nothing to those who listen with madness." "I bring the dead's memory," she said, unwrapping the journals. "And proof of betrayal." A murmur rippled through the onlookers. She laid the journals on the elder's table, each spine cracked by age, each page full of the delicate handwriting of a woman who had once healed their fevers and dressed their wounds. Tharn glanced at the others, then opened the first book. He began to read silently. His brow furrowed, then deepened. Ilya stepped forward, voice rising. "My mother was no witch. She was a healer. She saved your children, your wives. She stayed awake through storms to bring comfort to your dying. And yet you let her name rot beneath the soil because someone told you she was dangerous." "Those are just words," Cyril snapped, her voice brittle. "Stories from a madwoman. You were always strange, Ilya. Always whispering at graves." Ilya looked at her then, not as a victim, not as a child, but as someone standing above a lie. "My mother wrote that you came to her for herbs," she said, pulling a smaller page free, holding it up. "You came for a tincture after your own son nearly died from infection. She saved him. You begged her to keep it quiet. And then, when the whispers began, you stayed silent." Cyril blanched. "That's a lie," Jurin barked, stepping forward. "She's twisting everything." Ilya turned to him. "You set the fire. You tried to burn what you couldn't understand. You found the locket in my room and tried to destroy it because it held the truth you couldn't hide." The crowd stiffened. Someone gasped. Someone else muttered a prayer. Elder Tharn lifted his hand. "Do you have proof of this?" Ilya nodded. She held up the scorched remains of the carved box, retrieved from the ashes. Inside it, the locket, blackened but whole. She opened it, revealing the picture of her mother, and tucked behind it, a folded slip of paper with a pressed flower. The same flower that bloomed from the grave. The old woman who had once warned her about answering the dead stepped forward. "I remember that flower," she said, voice trembling. "Your mother brought it to my son when he had the fever. It grew only in her garden. I saw her crush it into tea and speak to it like it was alive. It cured him. I never told anyone. I was afraid." Ilya looked at her. "Thank you." The woman bowed her head. Others began to murmur. Then a merchant, older, heavy-set, stepped forward. "I remember," he said. "I came to her when my daughter's birth was turning. The midwife had left. She saved them both. I didn't speak because I thought it better to forget. But I knew. We all did." A hush fell. The village tribunal was not a court of laws, it was a court of memory. And memory had begun to return like floodwater. Ilya stood taller now. "You let them condemn her," she said. "You let my stepmother poison your minds, let my stepbrother's lies go unpunished. You let your fears speak louder than gratitude. But no more." She turned slowly, her voice gathering power. "I speak now not just for her. I speak for every woman you called witch when she spoke too loudly. For every healer you silenced because she didn't use your prayers. For every orphan you left to be bruised by the hands of the same people who fed you gossip and called it truth." Her words echoed. Even the wind stilled. Cyril was pale. Jurin's fists were clenched. But the crowd had shifted. The silence that once haunted Ilya now stood behind her, holding her up. Elder Tharn closed the journal and nodded once, slowly. "We have judged too easily in the past," he said. "And remained too quiet. The girl speaks truth, truth that cannot be buried." He turned to Cyril and Jurin. "There will be an accounting." "What?" Jurin spat. "You'll believe the dead over the living?" "No," Tharn said, rising to his full, fragile height. "We believe the living who remember. The ones who carry what was done and choose not to look away. That is the truest kind of witness." He pointed toward the village path. "You are banished, both of you. For deceit. For endangering the child left in your care. For desecrating a grave meant to be left in peace." Cyril collapsed to her knees, wailing. Jurin cursed and stormed off. But no one followed them. The villagers stayed with Ilya. And as the crowd dispersed, some came to her, pressing her hands, murmuring apologies, offering quiet support. One gave her a pouch of dried fruit. Another a shawl. The old woman pressed her fingers to Ilya's forehead and whispered something she couldn't quite understand, but felt like protection. Later, alone again in the garden, Ilya sat beneath the arbor and breathed deeply. It was not joy. Not exactly. Justice was rarely that sweet. It was sorrow meeting clarity and choosing to bloom anyway. She opened the next journal. She lit a small candle. She placed the flower from the grave at the garden's edge. And she whispered to the soil. "We did it, Mama." The roots below didn't stir. But they didn't need to. Some truths had already risen. The garden, once hidden and wild, was now a space of care. Ilya worked with quiet hands, unhurried, her fingers dark with soil and her shoulders kissed by the sun. The brambles that had choked its borders were gone, cleared away with her own blade and breath. In their place grew herbs her mother once favored: lavender for calming dreams, marigold for wounds, hibiscus and wild sage, winding like memories through the earth. Villagers came hesitantly at first. A scraped knee, a stubborn cough, a question about teas that soothed sleep. She offered what she could without pride or judgment, and soon the garden became more than a place of healing. It became a place of trust. Each morning, before the village stirred, Ilya walked the winding path up to her mother's grave, cradling a single flower. Sometimes it was a bloom her mother once grew. Sometimes it was one the garden had given her unexpectedly, as if the earth remembered something she did not. She knelt by the headstone, still cracked but clean now, the fracture softened by vines that bloomed year-round. The grave no longer whispered. The light no longer shone from below. Whatever had risen that night had returned to stillness. But the silence was never empty. Ilya would press the flower into the soil and speak aloud, one story each day. Some stories were old. The time her mother made a medicine that saved a fevered child, the way she hummed while grinding herbs. Other stories were fragments Ilya had learned through dreams or journals, of her mother's girlhood, of her laughter, of how she loved the smell of wet leaves after rain. She did not know who listened. But she spoke anyway, because remembrance was a kind of tending. And love, even unspoken, grew roots. Some afternoons she would find children gathered at the edge of the garden, watching as she worked. One by one they began to help. They learned which roots to harvest and which to leave. They asked why she whispered to the soil. Ilya only smiled and told them, because it remembers. One little girl named Fenya began bringing flowers of her own. Small, crumpled blooms plucked from roadside weeds. Ilya never corrected her. Instead, she gave the child a small patch to grow whatever she liked. "She's like you," the old woman who once warned her said one day, bringing a jar of wild honey. "Talks to the ground like it might answer." "She doesn't need it to answer," Ilya replied softly, arranging the herbs. "She just needs to be heard." That evening, when the wind picked up and rustled the garden's edges, Ilya felt something familiar move through it. Not a voice. Not a whisper. But laughter. Soft like breath between trees. Not loud enough for anyone else to hear, but Ilya paused mid-step, a basket of calendula in her hands, and looked toward the grave. She smiled. She said nothing. She just stood for a moment in the fading light, letting the sound drift over her like warmth. Her stepfamily was long gone. The village no longer flinched when they saw her. Some still offered awkward nods and kept their distance, but many had changed. Not because she demanded it, but because they watched her stay. They watched her work. They watched her care for them even when they didn't deserve it. Change, she had learned, was not a fire. It was a bloom. And it came slowly but surely if the soil was tended. And this soil, once silent, was blooming. In time, Ilya began crafting a small book of her own. Her mother's journals had shown her the value of words passed down. So she wrote what she remembered, what she learned. She wrote recipes and spells and songs. But she also wrote feelings, things she wished she had said. It was not for her. It was for the girl who might come after her. The one who might kneel by a grave and think her voice had no place. Every story Ilya told at the graveside became a page in that book. Every flower planted became a marker, not of death but of enduring presence. The garden flourished. The grave bloomed. And some evenings, when the wind passed low and tender through the trees, Ilya would close her eyes and hear it again. That laughter, light and free, like a woman dancing barefoot through grass. She never looked over her shoulder. She didn't need to. Some roots grew too deep to ever be dug up again. And some love, once buried, rose like morning.